Dust swirled through Redemption, Arizona, a town etched with the harsh realities of the desert. Buildings stood like weathered sentinels, their paint peeling under the relentless sun. Life here was a daily struggle, a constant battle against drought, dust, and despair. The people, hardened by their environment, clung to a rigid moral code, enforced by the stern hand of preacher Jedediah. Redemption wasn't a place for second chances. Mistakes were met with swift and unforgiving justice, often dispensed in the shadow of the town's only church. The church itself was a simple structure, its white paint faded and cracked, but it stood as a symbol of order and righteousness in a lawless land. Or so the townsfolk believed. The whispers started like a desert breeze, carrying tales of hardship and desperation. Crops had failed, cattle were dying, and hunger gnawed at the bellies of even the most God-fearing families. This hardship, however, seemed to fuel a simmering undercurrent of judgment, a need to find someone to blame for their collective misfortune. It was in this atmosphere of fear and desperation that Sarah's troubles began, casting a dark shadow over the already struggling town of Redemption. Sarah was barely more than a girl, her face framed by sun-bleached hair and her eyes holding a mixture of fear and defiance. She lived on the outskirts of Redemption, in a small, dilapidated shack with her younger siblings and ailing mother. Their farm, once a source of pride and sustenance, had withered under the relentless drought, leaving them with nothing but dust and despair. Accusations had been whispered, growing louder with each passing day. Some said she'd stolen food from the general store, a desperate act to feed her starving family. Others claimed she defied preacher Jedediah's authority, questioning his sermons that seemed to offer little comfort in the face of their suffering. Whatever the truth, Sarah had become a scapegoat, a symbol of everything that was wrong with Redemption. The whispers turned into shouts, the accusations into judgments. Preacher Jedediah, seizing the opportunity to reinforce his authority, declared Sarah a sinner, a blight upon their righteous community. He called for a public whipping, a harsh punishment meant to serve as an example to anyone who dared to stray from the path of righteousness. Sarah, alone and defenseless, found herself caught in the crosshairs of a town consumed by fear and desperation. The day of the whipping dawned hot and unforgiving, mirroring the mood of the town. A makeshift post stood erected in front of the church, casting a long, ominous shadow across the dusty ground. Townsfolk gathered, their faces a mixture of grim anticipation and uneasy discomfort. Some clutched Bibles, muttering prayers, while others simply stared, their eyes reflecting the harsh reality of their circumstances. Preacher Jedediah, his face flushed with self-righteous indignation, stood on the church steps, his voice booming across the crowd. He spoke of sin and repentance, of a need to cleanse their community of wickedness. His words were met with a chorus of amens and nods of agreement, but beneath the surface, a sense of unease lingered. Sarah was brought forward, her hands bound, her face pale but resolute. She walked with her head held high, refusing to show fear, even as the weight of the town's judgment pressed down upon her. The air crackled with tension, the silence broken only by the rustling of clothes and the occasional nervous cough. Redemption was about to witness a spectacle of punishment, a stark reminder of the consequences of defiance. The stage was set, the players in place, and the drama about to unfold. The first lash cracked through the air, a sound that echoed through the silent crowd like a gunshot. Sarah gasped, her body recoiling from the impact. A thin red line appeared on her back, quickly followed by another and another. Each strike was a brutal reminder of her alleged transgression, a public display of the town's unforgiving justice. Some in the crowd averted their eyes, unable to bear witness to the suffering. Others watched with a morbid fascination, their faces betraying a complex mix of emotions: fear, guilt, and perhaps even a flicker of sympathy. A few, emboldened by preacher Jedediah's rhetoric, seemed to revel in Sarah's pain, their faces twisted into expressions of cruel satisfaction. Sarah bit back her cries, refusing to give her tormentors the satisfaction of seeing her break. Her body trembled with each blow, but her spirit remained unbroken. She focused on the faces in the crowd, searching for a glimmer of compassion, a sign that someone, anyone, might intervene. But all she saw were reflections of fear and judgment, a town consumed by its own darkness. The whipping continued, a relentless assault on her body and spirit, a grim spectacle played out under the unforgiving Arizona sun. From the edge of town, a lone figure appeared. He rode a dusty Appaloosa horse, its gait slow and deliberate. The man was a study in weather resilience. His face, etched with deep lines, spoke of countless sunrises and hardships endured. A wide-brimmed hat shielded his eyes, but his gaze was sharp and unwavering, taking in every detail of the scene before him. He wore simple, worn clothing, a faded blue shirt, denim pants, and scuffed leather boots. A gun belt, slung low on his hips, hinted at a past he likely preferred to keep hidden. He was a stranger, an outsider, a silent observer arriving in redemption at the town's darkest hour. The cowboy paused at the edge of the crowd, his presence immediately drawing attention. The whipping continued, but the rhythm faltered, the executioner momentarily distracted by the newcomer. The cowboy didn't speak, didn't move, simply watched. But there was something in his gaze, a quiet intensity that suggested he was anything but indifferent to the spectacle unfolding before him. He was a force of nature, a silent storm gathering on the horizon. The cowboy's eyes, though shadowed by his hat, missed nothing. He saw the raw welts on Sarah's back, the blood trickling down her skin. He saw the fear in her eyes, but also the unwavering spark of defiance. He saw the faces of the townsfolk, the mixture of emotions that painted a portrait of a community divided and struggling. He noted the tight grip the executioner had on the whip, the almost gleeful expression on his face. He observed Preacher Jedediah, his chest puffed out with self-importance, his eyes burning with righteous fury. The cowboy saw the injustice of it all, the cruelty masked as piety, the desperation fueling the town's descent into barbarity. His jaw tightened, a subtle indication of the anger simmering beneath his stoic exterior. He shifted slightly in his saddle, his hand instinctively moving towards the gun belt at his hip. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He had seen this kind of injustice before, and he knew that sometimes silence was not an option. The air grew thick with anticipation, the crowd sensing that the cowboy's arrival was more than just a coincidence. Something was about to change in redemption. Another lash fell, and this time, Sarah cried out, a sound that pierced the cowboy's heart like a shard of glass. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated pain, the sound of a spirit breaking. The cowboy's face remained impassive, a mask of stoicism honed by years of hardship and loss. But behind that mask, his eyes burned with a growing fury. He had seen too much suffering in his life, too much injustice disguised as righteousness. He had learned that sometimes the only way to stop evil was to confront it head-on, regardless of the consequences. The resolve hardened in his eyes, a silent promise to himself and to Sarah. He slowly dismounted his horse, the creak of the saddle leather cutting through the tense silence. He didn't rush, didn't shout, didn't make any grand pronouncements. He simply moved with a quiet determination, his every step deliberate and purposeful. The crowd watched, mesmerized, as the silent cowboy began his slow, inexorable march towards the whipping post. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The air crackled with unspoken tension, a prelude to the storm that was about to break over redemption. Preacher Jedediah, his face contorted with rage, finally found his voice. "Stop right there, stranger," he bellowed, his voice cracking with indignation. "This is a matter of God's justice. You have no right to interfere." The cowboy didn't break stride. He continued his slow, deliberate advance, his eyes fixed on Sarah, his focus unwavering. He was a man on a mission, impervious to the preacher's threats and the crowd's growing unease. I said stop, Jedediah repeated, his voice rising in pitch. He took a step forward, attempting to block the cowboy's path. This woman is a sinner. She must be punished. Still, the cowboy remained silent. He simply raised his hand, a gesture that was both subtle and commanding. It was a signal that he would not be deterred, that he was prepared to face whatever consequences his actions might bring. The preacher hesitated, sensing the unwavering resolve in the cowboy's eyes. A ripple of uncertainty spread through the crowd. The cowboy was close now, just a few feet from the whipping post, his presence a tangible challenge to the town's authority and the preacher's power. The stage was set for a confrontation, a battle between justice and vengeance, between silence and words. With a swift, decisive movement, the cowboy reached out and caught the whip midair, the leather coiling around his calloused hand. The executioner, startled by the sudden intervention, stumbled backward, his eyes wide with disbelief. The whipping stopped, the silence that followed heavier than any sound. The cowboy didn't look at the executioner, didn't acknowledge him in any way. His focus remained solely on Sarah. He took another step forward, placing himself directly between her and the crowd, a silent shield against their judgment and their cruelty. Preacher Jedediah sputtered, his face turning an apoplectic shade of red. "Seize him," he roared, gesturing toward the cowboy. "He's defying God's law." But no one moved. The townsfolk were frozen, caught between their loyalty to the preacher and their own growing doubts about the righteousness of their actions. The cowboy stood firm, a solitary figure challenging the collective will of the town. He had stopped the whipping, but the battle was far from over. The real fight, the fight for the soul of redemption, was just beginning. The question now was, who would dare to stand with him? The silence stretched, taut, and unbreakable. The only sound was the wind whispering through the dusty streets of redemption, carrying with it the weight of unspoken words and simmering tensions. Preacher Jedediah's face was a mask of fury, his eyes darting between the cowboy and the frozen townsfolk, desperate to regain control of the situation. "What is the meaning of this?" he finally demanded, his voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "Do you dare to question God's judgment? This woman is a sinner, and she must pay for her crimes." The cowboy remained silent, his gaze unwavering. He slowly knelt beside Sarah, his movements gentle and respectful. He reached out and carefully untied the ropes that bound her wrists to the post. His touch was tender, a stark contrast to the brutality she had just endured. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their faces reflecting a mixture of confusion, apprehension, and a growing sense of unease. The cowboy's actions spoke louder than any words, challenging their beliefs and forcing them to confront the darkness that had taken root in their town. He had stopped the whipping, but he had also unleashed something far more powerful: doubt. And doubt, in a town like Redemption, was a dangerous thing indeed. Sarah's legs buckled beneath her, her body weakened by the brutal whipping. The cowboy, anticipating her fall, gently supported her, his strong arm providing a steady anchor. He didn't speak, didn't offer words of comfort or reassurance. He simply held her, his presence a silent promise of protection. He carefully guided her away from the whipping post, away from the judging eyes of the crowd. Her back was a mass of welts and bruises, her clothes torn and bloodied. Her spirit, though battered, was not broken. She looked up at the cowboy, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. Preacher Jedediah, his authority crumbling before his very eyes, stepped forward, his voice dripping with venom. "Who are you?" he demanded, his gaze piercing. "What gives you the right to interfere with God's will?" The cowboy finally broke his silence, his voice low and gravelly, but carrying a weight of authority that silenced the crowd. "I'm just a man," he said, his eyes fixed on the preacher's, "trying to do what's right." His words were simple, but they resonated with a power that shook the very foundations of redemption. The battle for the town's soul had truly begun. The cowboy's arm remained around Sarah, not in a possessive or romantic way, but as a solid, unwavering source of strength. She leaned into him slightly, finding solace in his quiet presence. He was a stranger, yet he offered her more comfort than anyone in her own town had shown. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep compassion. He saw the physical pain etched on her face, the raw welts on her back, the blood staining her clothes. But he also saw something else, a flicker of resilience, a spark of hope that had not been extinguished by the brutality she had endured. He tightened his grip slightly, a silent message of encouragement. He knew that words were not enough, that Sarah needed more than just empty platitudes. She needed someone to stand by her, to offer her unwavering support, to help her rebuild her shattered life. And that, he silently vowed, was exactly what he would do. He would be her shield, her protector, her silent advocate in a town that had turned against her. The healing could begin, not with words, but with unwavering action and silent support. Preacher Jedediah, sputtering with indignation, stepped closer, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Are you harboring a fugitive, stranger?" he demanded, his voice laced with accusation. "Do you condone her sins? Are you an enemy of God?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some of the townsfolk shifted uneasily, their loyalty to the preacher wavering. Others glared at the cowboy, their faces hardened with judgment. The air crackled with tension, the silence broken only by the whisper of the wind and the preacher's venomous words. "This woman has broken the law," Jedediah continued, his voice rising in pitch. "She has defied God's will, and she must be punished. You are obstructing justice, stranger, and you will answer for your actions." The cowboy, still holding Sarah, remained unmoved. He didn't flinch, didn't back down, didn't offer any explanation. His silence was a powerful statement, a refusal to engage in the preacher's twisted logic. He simply stood his ground, a silent sentinel protecting the vulnerable from the wrath of a self-righteous mob. The tension escalated, threatening to erupt into violence. The fate of Sarah, and perhaps the fate of redemption, hung precariously in the balance. Would the town succumb to fear and judgment, or would someone dare to stand with the cowboy and embrace compassion? "We have a right to know who you are and why you're interfering," a voice called out from the crowd. It was Caleb, the blacksmith, a man known for his strength and his unwavering loyalty to preacher Jedediah. Several other townsfolk echoed his sentiment, their voices growing louder and more insistent. The cowboy remained silent for a long moment, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the crowd. He saw the fear, the anger, the uncertainty. He knew that he couldn't reason with them, not with words alone. He had to reach them on a deeper level, to challenge their beliefs and force them to question their own actions. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady, but carrying a resonance that silenced the crowd. "You ask me who I am?" he said, his eyes fixed on preacher Jedediah. "I'm the man who saw a wrong being done, and I couldn't stand by and do nothing." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You call this justice?" he continued, his voice rising slightly. "Whipping a young woman in front of the whole town? Is this what your God teaches? Is this how you show compassion?" The questions hung in the air, unanswered, a challenge to the very heart of redemption's beliefs. A confrontation was unavoidable, and the cowboy was ready to face it head-on. A flicker of memory crossed the cowboy's face, a brief glimpse of a past he rarely spoke of. He remembered another time, another town, another woman wrongly accused. He had stood by then, hesitant and uncertain, and the consequences had haunted him ever since. He wouldn't make that mistake again. His wife, Martha, had been accused of witchcraft, fueled by the fear and superstition of a small, isolated community. He had tried to defend her, but his words were drowned out by the mob's frenzy. He had watched helplessly as she was taken away, condemned to a fate he couldn't prevent. The memory of her terrified eyes, the sound of her desperate cries, still echoed in his nightmares. That day, he had learned a harsh lesson, that silence in the face of injustice was complicity, that sometimes the only way to fight darkness was to stand against it, even if it meant standing alone. He looked at Sarah, seeing a reflection of Martha's vulnerability and his own past failings. He knew that he couldn't save Martha, but he could save Sarah. He owed it to both of them. The flashback ended, and his resolve solidified. He was here to stay. The cowboy straightened his shoulders, his gaze hardening as he addressed the crowd. "You ask about justice," he said, his voice resonating with a newfound strength. "Look around you. Is this what you call a righteous community? A place where fear and judgment rule, where compassion is a weakness, and where a young woman is publicly tortured for a petty crime?" He paused, letting his words sink in. "You hide behind your Bibles and your prayers," he continued, his voice rising in intensity. "But what about the teachings of forgiveness and mercy? What about the commandment to love thy neighbor?" He swept his gaze across the faces of the townsfolk, challenging them to look into their own hearts. "You are so quick to condemn Sarah," he said, his voice softening slightly. "But what about your own sins? What about the times you've cheated your neighbors, gossiped behind their backs, or turned a blind eye to their suffering?" He paused again, letting his words resonate. "Before you cast the first stone," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction, "ask yourselves, are you truly without sin?" The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the whisper of the wind and the beating of guilty hearts. The cowboy had planted a seed of doubt, and now it was up to the townsfolk to decide whether it would take root and blossom into compassion or wither and die in the arid soil of redemption. A murmur spread through the crowd. Some of the townsfolk lowered their heads, shamefaced, remembering their own transgressions. Others remained defiant, their faces hardened with resentment. But a few, their eyes filled with a newfound uncertainty, began to look at Sarah with a flicker of compassion. Mary, the baker's wife, stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly. "Sarah has always been a good girl," she said, her eyes fixed on preacher Jedediah. "She's worked hard to care for her family, especially since her mother fell ill." John, the farmer, nodded in agreement. "She took some bread from my stall a while back," he admitted, "but she promised to pay me back when she could. I never thought she stole it." A ripple of dissent spread through the crowd, their voices growing louder and more confident. The cowboy's words had struck a chord, challenging their preconceived notions and forcing them to question their own judgment. The tide was beginning to turn in Sarah's favor, but the battle was far from over. Preacher Jedediah, his authority threatened, was not about to back down without a fight. The soul of redemption was still up for grabs. Preacher Jedediah, his face contorted with fury, slammed his fist on the makeshift pulpit. "Blasphemy!" he roared, his voice echoing through the stunned silence. "This stranger is spreading lies and sedition. He is turning you against God and against your own community." He pointed a trembling finger at the cowboy. "He is a troublemaker, a charlatan, a wolf in sheep's clothing. Don't listen to his honeyed words. He is leading you down a path of sin and destruction." He turned to the crowd, his eyes burning with righteous indignation. "Are you going to let this outsider dictate your beliefs? Are you going to abandon the laws of God and follow this sinner?" He paused, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the townsfolk. "I have led you for years. I have guided you through hardship and despair. Have I ever led you astray?" He stretched out his arms, appealing to their loyalty and their faith. "Stand with me, my brothers and sisters. Stand with God. Let us cast out this evil and reclaim our righteous community." The tension in the air was palpable, the fate of redemption hanging precariously in the balance. Would the town rally behind their preacher, or would they embrace the message of compassion and forgiveness offered by the silent cowboy? A figure pushed through the crowd, his presence commanding attention. It was Samuel, the town's doctor, a man respected for his wisdom and his unwavering commitment to helping others. He had always been a quiet observer, rarely taking sides in the town's disputes. But now, his face etched with determination, he stepped forward to challenge preacher Jedediah's authority. "Enough, Jedediah," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This has gone on long enough. We've all been blinded by fear and judgment, but it's time to open our eyes and see the truth." He turned to the crowd, his gaze sweeping across their faces. "Sarah is not a sinner," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "She's a young woman struggling to care for her family in a time of hardship. She may have made mistakes, but we all have. And she doesn't deserve to be treated like this." He looked back at Preacher Jedediah, his eyes filled with disappointment. "You preach about forgiveness and compassion," he said, "but where is the forgiveness and compassion in your heart?" The crowd was stunned into silence. Samuel's words, spoken with such quiet conviction, had pierced through the preacher's rhetoric and resonated with the town's growing sense of unease. The tide was turning, and the battle for redemption was about to reach its climax. The crowd began to murmur, their faces reflecting a growing sense of division. Some clung to Preacher Jedediah's words, their eyes filled with fear and resentment. Others, touched by Samuel's compassion and the cowboy's unwavering presence, began to question their own beliefs. The town was split, a chasm widening between those who clung to the old ways and those who dared to embrace a new vision of justice and forgiveness. Caleb, the blacksmith, a man known for his strength and his unwavering loyalty to the preacher, stepped forward, his face etched with conflict. He looked at Preacher Jedediah, then at Sarah, then at the cowboy. He clenched and unclenched his fists, struggling with his own conscience. I don't know what to believe anymore," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I've always trusted you, Jedediah, but I can't ignore what I've seen here today. I can't ignore the look in Sarah's eyes or the pain on her face. And I can't ignore the words of this stranger." He took a deep breath, his decision made. "I stand with Samuel," he declared, his voice ringing with newfound conviction. "I stand with Sarah, and I stand against this cruelty." His words were a thunderclap, shattering the uneasy calm and signaling the beginning of a new era in redemption. The lines had been drawn, and the battle for the town's soul was about to begin in earnest. A chorus of voices erupted, some shouting their support for Caleb and Samuel, others clinging to Preacher Jedediah's teachings, their faces contorted with anger and fear. The town, once united by shared belief in their rigid moral code, was now fractured, torn apart by doubt and conflicting loyalties. Mary, the baker's wife, stepped forward to stand beside Caleb, her face etched with determination. "I've known Sarah since she was a little girl," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "She's always been kind and hardworking. She doesn't deserve this." John, the farmer, joined them, his hand resting on Caleb's shoulder. "We've all made mistakes," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's time we showed some compassion instead of just judgment." But others remained steadfast in their support of Preacher Jedediah. Thomas, the owner of the general store, stepped forward, his face grim. "We can't let this outsider undermine our authority," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "We have to stand strong against this rebellion." The lines were drawn, the sides clearly defined. The fate of redemption hung in the balance, dependent on whether the forces of compassion and forgiveness could overcome the deeply entrenched beliefs of fear and judgment. The battle was far from over, and the tension in the air was almost unbearable. The two factions faced each other, a silent battle of wills playing out under the unforgiving Arizona sun. Preacher Jedediah, his face red with fury, glared at Caleb and Samuel, his eyes filled with resentment. Caleb, his jaw set with determination, stood his ground, his hand resting protectively on Mary's shoulder. The other townsfolk, caught in the middle, shifted uneasily, unsure of what to do. Sarah, leaning against the cowboy for support, looked at the faces in the crowd, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and fear. She had never imagined that anyone would stand up for her, that anyone would dare to challenge Preacher Jedediah's authority. But now, as she looked at Caleb, Samuel, and Mary, she felt a flicker of hope ignite within her. The cowboy, his arms still around Sarah, remained silent, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the crowd. He knew that the next few moments would determine the fate of redemption. He knew that it was up to him to say something, to do something to tip the scales in favor of compassion and forgiveness. He took a deep breath, his voice low but clear. carrying across the tense silence. "This isn't about sin," he said, his eyes fixed on preacher Jedediah. "It's about redemption. It's about giving people a second chance. It's about choosing love over hate." Preacher Jedediah, his face a mask of defeat, lowered his head, his shoulders slumping. The fight had gone out of him, his authority shattered by the cowboy's words and the growing dissent within the town. He looked at the faces of his former followers, their eyes filled with doubt and disappointment, and he knew that he had lost. He slowly stepped down from the makeshift pulpit, his movements heavy and defeated. He didn't say a word, didn't offer any explanation. He simply turned and walked away, his head bowed, his reign of fear and judgment finally over. A collective sigh swept through the crowd, a release of the tension that had gripped redemption for so long. The townsfolk looked at each other, their faces reflecting a mixture of relief, uncertainty, and a glimmer of hope. The spell had been broken, the darkness had been lifted, and the town was finally free to choose its own destiny. The cowboy, still holding Sarah, watched as preacher Jedediah disappeared into the distance. He knew that the road ahead would not be easy, that the town would face many challenges as it struggled to rebuild its shattered community. But he also knew that redemption had taken its first step towards a brighter future, a future built on compassion, forgiveness, and love. And that, he thought, was a victory worth fighting for. The days that followed were a time of reflection and rebuilding for redemption. The townsfolk, grappling with the consequences of their actions, began to reach out to Sarah and her family, offering assistance and support. Mary, the baker's wife, brought them fresh bread and supplies. John, the farmer, offered them a share of his harvest. And Samuel, the doctor, tended to Sarah's wounds, both physical and emotional. The town council, now led by Caleb and Samuel, began to implement new policies, emphasizing compassion and forgiveness over judgment and punishment. They established a fund to help families struggling with poverty and hardship. They organized community meetings to discuss their shared values and to ensure that everyone had a voice in shaping the future of redemption. It wasn't easy. There were still those who clung to the old ways, who resented the changes that were taking place. But the tide had turned, and the forces of compassion and understanding were slowly but surely gaining ground. Redemption was finally living up to its name, becoming a place where second chances were possible, where forgiveness was valued, and where everyone had the opportunity to build a better life. The healing process was underway, and the future, though uncertain, was filled with hope. The cowboy, his work in redemption complete, prepared to leave. He had never intended to stay, his life a constant journey, a search for peace and a way to atone for the mistakes of his past. But he knew that he had made a difference, that he had helped to plant a seed of compassion in a town that desperately needed it. He saddled his Appaloosa, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked back at the town, at the faces of the people he had helped to save. He saw Sarah standing with her family, her face radiant with hope. He saw Caleb and Samuel standing shoulder to shoulder, their eyes filled with determination. He knew that redemption was in good hands. He mounted his horse, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He had a long road ahead of him, but he carried with him the satisfaction of knowing that he had done what was right. He had stood up for the vulnerable, he had challenged injustice, and he had helped to create a better world, one small town at a time. He touched his hat, a silent farewell, and rode off into the sunset, leaving behind a town forever changed by his presence. The legend of the silent cowboy would live on in redemption for generations to come. Sarah, her back still aching but her heart filled with gratitude, approached the cowboy as he prepared to leave. She walked with a newfound confidence, her head held high, her eyes shining with hope. She had been broken, but she had also been healed, and she knew that she owed it all to this silent stranger. I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You saved my life. You saved my family. You saved this town." The cowboy smiled, a rare and precious sight. "You don't need to thank me," he said, his voice soft and gentle. "You saved yourself. You had the strength to endure, the courage to stand tall, and the spirit to never give up. All I did was give you a little help along the way." He paused, his gaze locking with hers. "Remember," he said, "redemption is always possible. No matter how dark things may seem, there's always a chance for a new beginning. Never lose hope, Sarah. Never lose faith in yourself." He touched his hat, a silent farewell, and turned to leave. But before he could ride away, Sarah reached out and gently touched his arm. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes filled with tears. "For everything." The cowboy nodded, his heart filled with a quiet satisfaction. He had made a difference, and that was all that mattered. The cowboy turned his horse towards the setting sun, his silhouette outlined against the fiery sky. He rode slowly, deliberately, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He was a wanderer, a drifter, a man without a home. But he carried with him the knowledge that he had made a difference, that he had helped to create a better world, even if only for a short time. He knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, that he would face many more challenges in his life. But he also knew that he was not alone, that there were other people out there struggling to do what was right, to stand up for the vulnerable, and to fight for a better world. And that, he thought, was enough. He spurred his horse forward, his silhouette disappearing into the gathering darkness. The legend of the silent cowboy would live on in redemption, a reminder that even the smallest act of kindness can have a profound impact, that even the most silent voice can be heard, and that even in the darkest of times, hope can always be found. He was gone, but his spirit remained, a beacon of light in a world that desperately needed it. The sun set, and the stars began to appear, shining down on the town of redemption, a testament to the power of compassion and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Sarah stood on the dusty street, watching the cowboy disappear into the horizon. The setting sun cast long shadows across the town, painting the buildings in hues of orange and gold. She clutched a small, smooth stone in her hand, a gift from her younger brother, a symbol of hope and resilience. She turned and walked towards her family, her steps light and purposeful. She had a life to rebuild, a community to help heal, and a future to create. And she knew that, with the help of her friends and neighbors, she could do anything. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, shining down on the town of redemption, a symbol of hope, forgiveness, and the enduring power of the human spirit. The story of the silent cowboy would be told and retold in redemption for generations, a reminder that even the smallest act of courage and compassion can change the world. The wind whispered through redemption, carrying the scent of rain and the promise of a new beginning. Sarah walked towards a small shack she called home, her steps filled with purpose. Her younger siblings ran to greet her, their faces beaming with joy. She hugged them tightly, her heart overflowing with love. Inside the shack, her mother lay resting, her face pale but peaceful. Sarah knelt beside her, taking her hand. "We're going to be okay, Mama," she whispered, her voice filled with conviction. "Things are going to get better." Her mother smiled, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I know they will, my dear," she said, her voice weak but steady. "We have good people in this town, and we have each other." Sarah stood up, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The sun had set, but the sky was filled with a soft, warm glow. She saw a glimmer of hope in the distance, a promise of a brighter future. She knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but she was ready to face it with courage, compassion, and the unwavering support of her family and her community. Redemption had been through a dark time, but it had emerged stronger and more resilient. The memory of the silent cowboy would forever be etched in the hearts of the townsfolk, a reminder that even the smallest act of kindness can change the world. And Sarah, once the victim of injustice, would become a symbol of hope, forgiveness, and the enduring power of the human spirit in a town finally worthy of its name.